Part 1. The weed that saved a kingdom. Imagine stepping into a world where the sun has forgotten its duty. A world where the sky hangs low and permanently grey, where every field feels like a soggy marsh, and where the noble crops, wheat and barley, the pride of Europe's aristocracy, are collapsing into rot. It is the late 17th century in northern Europe, and the continent is trapped inside a climate catastrophe we now call the Little Ice Age. The wealthy in the south can still dine on soft white bread, but for you, standing in this cold and unforgiving landscape, one truth becomes painfully clear. Those aristocratic grains will not save you. Instead, you are left with something humbler, something mocked, something everyone else dismissed as a diseased form of wheat, a stubborn weed that insisted on growing where nothing else would. That weed is Avena sativa, the common oat. Today we rebrand it with pride as a superfood, but for centuries it carried a different name, the poor man's wheat. It was the fragile but unbreakable thread between survival and starvation, especially during winters so brutal that the people of the time called them the 7 ill years. When the cold refused to lift, when the soil refused to dry, and when hunger dug its claws into entire kingdoms, it was this weed, this overlooked, unwanted grain, that stood between life and ruin. Welcome back to Historia Prime. Today we journey into the astonishing history of the oat, a grain insulted by scholars, banned by elites, dismissed by empires, yet secretly responsible for building the stamina of warriors and the resilience of northern civilizations. How did a weed rise from contempt to become a symbol of survival? And more importantly, what can its stubborn resilience teach us as we face our own era of climate uncertainty and fragile food systems? Settle in, because the story you're about to hear is not just about a grain, it's about a kingdom saved by humility, a people hardened by winter, and a lesson hiding in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. Let's begin. Part 2. The botanical outcast, from weed to necessity. Our story now shifts far back, 10,000 years into the past, into a world that looked nothing like the misty northern fields we began with. In the warm cradle of the Fertile Crescent, where ancient farmers carefully tended their majestic wheat and barley, something unexpected began to sprout between the royal rows. It was not planted, it was not wanted, it was simply there. The oat began its life not as a chosen crop, but as an accident, a weed, an intruder in the empire of grains. While wheat and barley thrived under the sun's generosity, oats preferred the shadows. They evolved on the margins, in the forgotten corners of fields, surviving neglect, poor soil, and harsh winds. And because of that, something remarkable happened. They developed a resilience the royal grains never needed. Strength through struggle, hardiness through being unwanted. Then, humanity began its slow march northward as people settled into colder, wetter lands, into the fog-drenched highlands of Scotland and the swampy forests of Scandinavia. Something became painfully obvious. The royal grains had followed their masters into exile, but they couldn't survive the new world. Wheat roots drowned in acidic soil. Barley rotted before it could ripen. The great grains of civilization were useless in the lands of endless rain. But the oat? The oat felt at home. It didn't protest the lack of sunlight. It didn't fear the cold. It didn't collapse under constant moisture. Instead, it flourished. And by the time the Iron Age arrived, this former nuisance had become the difference between a full stomach and famine. It was the quiet insurance policy of an unforgiving climate, a caloric buffer that let entire communities outlast the long northern winters. Yet here is the twist, the sting of historical irony. Even as oats fed the poor, fueled warriors, and saved lives, they were treated with contempt. To the Romans, who basked in Mediterranean warmth and wheat-filled granaries, oats were barbarian food. A grain fit for horses, not for civilized citizens. They mocked the northerners who depended on it, believing their diet proved their inferiority. This cultural insult would echo for centuries and ignite one of the most famous grain feuds in literary history. But that comes next. For now, remember this: sometimes the thing dismissed as a weed becomes the foundation of survival. Sometimes the outcast becomes the cornerstone. And sometimes the grain no one wants becomes the grain a kingdom cannot live without. Let's continue. Part 3. The Great Cereal Feud, Status and Stamina. As our story moves into the 18th century, we arrive at one of the most legendary intellectual duels ever fought over a grain. And it didn't happen in a field or a battlefield, but in the pages of a dictionary. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the towering English scholar of his age, decided to include oats in his monumental dictionary. But instead of a neutral definition, he wrote a line sharpened like a blade. He defined oats as a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. It was more than a definition. It was an insult woven into language itself. Johnson was mocking an entire nation, dismissing Scottish culture by comparing their staple food to livestock feed. He was performing a kind of culinary class warfare, using words to reinforce status and hierarchy. To him, wheat was the aristocrat, oats were for peasants. But Scotland had an answer, and it came from James Boswell, Johnson's own biographer, a proud Scotsman with a wit as sharp as a claymore. He replied, "Aye, and that's why England has such fine horses and Scotland has such fine men." It was a perfect comeback, and more importantly, it was true. Boswell didn't know the science behind his words, but he instinctively understood something modern nutritionists now confirm. Wheat may deliver quick bursts of energy, but it lacks the nutritional depth needed for sustained endurance. Oats, on the other hand, offer slow, steady power, higher protein, more healthy fats, a wealth of micronutrients, and most critically, beta-glucans, a remarkable soluble fiber that slows digestion and releases energy gradually over hours. This wasn't just food, this was fuel. And if you were a Highland soldier in the rugged north, marching 70 miles a day across mountains, battling cold winds and unforgiving terrain, that slow-release energy meant survival. It meant stamina the Southern armies could only dream of. It meant a body that didn't crash when the weather did. So while England fed its horses, Scotland fed its warriors. And inside this feud lies a deeper truth, one that echoes through history. Status does not equal strength. Reputation does not guarantee resilience. And sometimes the most powerful fuel comes from the grain everyone else mocks. As we continue, you'll see that this wasn't the last time oats would rise unexpectedly to the center of human survival. The next chapter reveals how our ancestors protected this humble grain with engineering so brilliant and so dangerous, it could cost you your life if you got it wrong. Let's move forward. Part 4. The Architecture of Winter Survival. As we move deeper into the world of the poor man's wheat, we enter a chapter where human ingenuity becomes just as important as the grain itself. Because in a land where the rain never stops, where winter moisture seeps into everything, and where a single spoiled harvest could mean starvation, one question overshadowed all others. How do you keep your food from rotting? This is where our ancestors reveal their brilliance, an engineering tradition carved not from luxury, but from necessity. To protect their precious oats and grains through never-ending winters, Iron Age communities developed one of the most astonishing storage systems ever created, the Cyrus Pit. Picture an underground, beehive-shaped chamber carved into the earth, the bottom lined with straw, the top sealed tight with clay, turf, or even pig bladders stretched over the opening like ancient vacuum packaging. But the genius wasn't in the structure, It was in the science. Once sealed, the grain inside began to breathe. It absorbed the oxygen in the chamber and exhaled carbon dioxide. And because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it collected at the bottom of the pit, forming a dense protective blanket. In that oxygen-free atmosphere, pests couldn't survive. Mold couldn't take hold. Bacteria couldn't multiply. Nature itself performed the sterilization. Wheat and oats stored in a properly sealed cirrus pit could last not just a year or two, but half a century. Yet this miracle of preservation came with a deadly trade-off. Opening a cirrus pit was like opening a tomb. If you climbed straight in, unaware of the invisible danger waiting below, the concentrated CO2 could knock you unconscious in seconds. Many didn't wake up again. And so, our ancestors developed a chilling but effective test. Before entering the pit, they would lower a lantern into the darkness. If the flame continued to burn, the air was safe. But if it flickered out, you stayed out. Because the grain had created a perfect survival environment for itself, one that could kill a human instantly. For daily access, they turned to a different architectural strategy, one that looked almost whimsical, yet solved a problem as old as farming itself. They built granaries elevated on saddle stones, mushroom-shaped pillars with wide, rounded caps. The design was deceptively simple. Rats could climb up the pillar, but when they reached the underside of the mushroom cap, they found no purchase, no grip, no path forward. The grain was safe, not behind walls or gates, but behind geometry. It was one of the earliest examples of passive defense in food storage. Low-tech, high efficiency, elegant, and nearly foolproof. In these structures, we see the heartbeat of winter survival. Ordinary people, with no formal science, building systems that could outlast storms, outthink predators, and preserve life through the longest nights. And as modern disasters, from floods to supply chain failures, remind us how fragile our food systems truly are, their lessons become more than history. They become instructions. Next, we'll step into the kitchens of the past, where fermentation, superstition, and practicality merge into one of the most ingenious food systems ever invented. Let's continue. Part 5. The Alchemy of the Kitchen. Porridge drawers and probiotics. Now we step from the granary into the heart of the home, the kitchen. And here the story of oats transforms from engineering and storage into something far more intimate, almost magical. Because survival wasn't only about keeping grain dry through a long winter. It was about turning that grain into food that strengthened the body, soothed the stomach, and lasted for days when work was long and daylight short. And so we begin with a strange little tool that has survived centuries, the spurtle. Imagine standing in a smoky Highland kitchen. A heavy iron pot bubbles over a peat fire. You reach for a wooden stick, simple, smooth, carved by hand, and begin to stir. This is the spurtle. To a true Scot, you never stir porridge with a spoon. A spoon is for eating, a spurtle is for crafting. And tradition insists that you stir clockwise with your right hand only. Anything else risks bad luck. Some say even the devil himself might appear if you stirred the wrong way. Superstition, perhaps, but every ancient culture wraps its survival food in ritual because rituals keep memory alive. Yet the real alchemy was not in the stirring, it was in what happened next. In the 18th century, Scottish families would often cook porridge in enormous batches, enough for days. But they didn't refrigerate it, they didn't seal it in jars. They did something that sounds almost unbelievable today. They poured the steaming porridge directly into a wooden dresser drawer. As the porridge cooled, it solidified into a dense, gelatinous block. Over the next few days, the natural lactic acid bacteria living in the wood began to ferment it gently. This fermentation did two extraordinary things. It preserved the porridge without spoiling, and it made it even more digestible, unlocking nutrients, softening fibers, and giving it a mild tang. When morning came, you simply opened the drawer like a treasure chest of survival food. You cut out a slice, wrapped it in cloth, and took it to the fields or the workshop. It was the original energy bar, portable, durable, nutritious, and created without a single ounce of waste. But the ingenuity didn't stop there. Even the inner husks of the oat, the seeds, were not thrown away. Scots would soak them for nearly a week, letting them sour and ferment until they became sowens, a thin, tangy gruel rich in probiotics. It was essentially an ancient yogurt, made not from milk, but from grain. In a world without refrigeration, without processed supplements, without modern digestive aids, this humble byproduct helped maintain gut health, improve immunity, and deliver essential calories during the coldest months. This was not cooking. This was survival chemistry. This was food that cared for you while you worked, while you traveled, while you endured the long reach of winter. And today, as modern nutrition science rushes to rediscover fermented foods, slow-release carbohydrates, gut-friendly microbes, and sustainable meal prep, we find ourselves echoing the wisdom of people who did all of this not because it was trendy, but because it was the only way to survive. Next, we step into a darker chapter: the famines, the failed colonies, and the desperate gambles of a nation fighting to stay alive. And through it all, one grain proves itself again as the final defender against starvation. Let's continue. Part 6. High Stakes: the famine and the failed colony. Now we arrive at the moment when the poor man's wheat faced its ultimate trial. A test written not in kitchens or granaries, but in the harsh ledger of life and death. The 1690s were a decade carved out of darkness, remembered forever as the 7 ill years. And they were ill indeed. Across the world, far beyond the knowledge of European farmers, volcanoes erupted with catastrophic force. Ash drifted into the upper atmosphere and formed a global veil that dimmed the sun. Temperatures fell, seasons shifted, and in Scotland, the cold tightened its grip like a clenched fist. It became the coldest decade in 750 years, an era when winter refused to end and the earth itself felt hostile. Crops across Europe withered, barley failed, wheat blackened in the fields. Even livestock starved as pastures froze over. Famine spread like wildfire through the countryside, leaving families to claw through snow for anything edible. This wasn't a single-year disaster. It was a compounding catastrophe, year after year, with no promise of relief. And in the midst of this desperation, Scotland made one of the boldest and most disastrous gambles in its history. The nation gathered a staggering sum, nearly 1/3 of its entire wealth, and poured it into a dream. The Darien colony, carved from the steaming jungles of what is now Panama. The plan was audacious. Darien would become a global trade gateway, a shortcut to the riches of the Orient. If it succeeded, Scotland would emerge as a major world power. But fate offered no mercy. While Scotland froze under volcanic winters, the colonists suffered under another enemy tropical disease: malaria, dysentery, heat that drained the strength from the strongest men. Supplies ran out, ships were lost, and within a few short years, the dream collapsed. The failure was so catastrophic that Scotland was pushed into economic ruin, leading directly to the Act of Union with England in 1707. A kingdom's independence ended in the shadow of famine. Yet, through all of this chaos, through the freezing fields, the dying cattle, the famine-born migrations, one grain refused to surrender: oats. When the temperature dropped by a single degree, wheat yields fell by 5%. Entire harvests could vanish overnight. But oats stood firm. They were naturally frost-resistant, moisture-tolerant, and stubbornly productive, even in soil that defeated every other crop. In a century defined by hunger, they were the last line of defense between the living and the dead. Without oats, historians agree the death toll would have been far, far worse. This was not just a grain, it was a survivor. It was the quiet backbone of a nation on the brink. And as we reflect on this era, we find an unsettling echo in our own time, because climate pressures are rising again, and once more, modern agriculture is built on fragile systems not designed for volatility. The oats' resilience is not just history, it is warning, wisdom, and blueprint. Next, we turn to a softer chapter, how the same grain that saved bodies also soothed minds and became a forgotten medicine of the modern age. Let's continue. Part 7. Medicine and the Modern Mind. As our journey with the poor man's wheat enters the modern era, something remarkable happens. Oats begin to step outside the kitchen, outside the fields, and even outside the granary. They enter the apothecary. In the 19th century, physicians discovered what Highland warriors and northern farmers had sensed for generations. Oats were more than a food. They were a medicine, an anchor for both body and mind. Glass bottles lined the shelves of Victorian pharmacies, each bearing a simple but powerful label, Avena sativa. And inside those bottles was a tincture that doctors classified as a nervine, a restorative tonic for the nervous system. This wasn't herbal superstition, it was mainstream medical practice. Avena sativa tincture was prescribed for exhaustion in factory workers, worn down by the grind of industrial life. It was recommended to soothe insomnia in a society suddenly illuminated by gas lamps and overstimulated by the clamor of modern cities. But perhaps most astonishing of all, it was used as a treatment for addiction, specifically opium and tobacco, the two great dependencies of the 19th century. Imagine that for a moment. The same grain that kept Highland soldiers marching 70 miles across unforgiving mountains, the same grain that kept entire nations alive through famine and volcanic winters, was now being used to heal the minds of people overwhelmed by a rapidly changing world. Oats formed an unlikely bridge across eras, a survival food in one century, a psychological support in the next. Where once it had fueled the muscles of warriors, now it calmed the nerves of workers who lived in brick cities instead of stone huts, who fought deadlines instead of winter storms, but who were just as vulnerable to exhaustion. And today, modern science is circling back once again. Research now suggests that compounds in oats may reduce stress, stabilize mood, and support cognitive endurance. The ancient grain continues to whisper its wisdom. Survival is never just physical. It is mental, emotional, and deeply human. And in a world where burnout, anxiety, and overstimulation define the modern condition, maybe the simplest grain offers the simplest reminder that resilience begins with nourishment, and healing often lives in the humblest places. Now, as we bring our journey to its final chapter, we return to the fields where this story began. Because the lesson of the oat, the weed that saved kingdoms, still matters today. And perhaps more than ever. Let's finish our story. Part 8. Conclusion. The lesson of the weed. And now, as our journey comes full circle, we return to the misty field where this story began. Picture yourself standing there once more, a bowl of warm porridge in your hands, steam rising into the grey air. It is here, in this quiet place, that the true lesson of the poor man's wheat becomes clear. Because in our modern world, we love aristocratic solutions. We chase technologies that promise miracles. We build systems that look powerful but often collapse under pressure. We design complexity as if fragility were not its inevitable shadow. Yet the oat stands in gentle defiance of all of this. It reminds us that strength often lives on the margins, that resilience is born not from privilege, but from persistence, and that sometimes the solution we mock as a weed is the very thing that saves us. Oats survived the Little Ice Age, they survived the Black Death, they survived volcanic winters, failed empires, and the insults of scholars who believed themselves too refined to eat them. And now, as we face rising climate uncertainty, shifting soils, and fragile global food systems, humanity is once again turning back to these ancient, low-input, high-yield grains. The oat never needed perfect conditions. It never asked for praise. It simply endured. Maybe it is time we stopped searching for the newest thing and started honoring the hardiest thing. The next time you sit down with a bowl of oatmeal, whether it's breakfast on a rushed morning or a quiet moment of comfort, remember what you're eating. This isn't just a healthy meal, it's a legacy of survival. It is the grain that built bodies, fortified minds, saved kingdoms, and continues to offer strength in a world still learning how to endure. If you enjoyed this journey into the architecture of survival, into the hidden genius of ordinary people, and the extraordinary power of humble things, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. And in the comments, tell me this: if you were stranded in a 17th century winter, with nothing but your wits and the landscape around you, what one survival skill would you want to have? I'm Historia Prime, and I'll see you in the next chapter of our past. Stay resilient.